started. Folks will continue to join in, but we have a lot to cover in an hour. My name is Jennifer Loving, and I work at Destination Home, and we're excited to take a deeper dive today about the Santa Clara County Community Plan to End Homelessness. And how we'll do it is in two parts. First, we're joined by Deputy Director of the Office of Supportive Housing, KJ Kaminsky, who's going to walk through an expanded version of the data that we shared last week. And then we're going to jump into a panel of our partners and friends who are responsible or doing work that is part of the strategies that we'll be discussing. And then we will take audience questions. So save your questions, put them in the chat, please, and we will get to as many as we can. And so as we're moving forward, we want to just set the tone that the community plan in homelessness is something that our community started back in 2015. I think that we're unique in terms of a jurisdiction that does this work together, meaning we have a collective impact model where we work on strategies to end and prevent homelessness together, and we hold ourselves accountable in this community plan. This community plan is executed both by system partners, the County of Santa Clara, the City of San Jose, the Housing Authority of the County of Santa Clara, and also all of the nonprofit providers, and also our lived experience leaders and partners. And so all together contributes to the strategies that we're going to be walking through. And the update, will show that tens of thousands of people have gotten off our streets, but there's a lot more to the data than that. And so with no further ado, I'd like to turn this over to KJ. She will walk us through the slides. And one last thing is there's a couple of links we'll put in the chat that give the background. One is the community plan, and also is a primer on understanding homelessness, so that we can keep those, bookmark those, and use those for reference as well. And so with that, I'd like to turn things over to KJ. Good morning, KJ.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Jen. And thank you everyone for joining us here today. I'm very excited to share our collective progress that we've made as a community. And as many of you are probably very familiar with our community plan to end homelessness, but if you're new to it, this was a plan that was developed with the input of the entire community, from people with lived expertise, our nonprofit partners, our city partners, advocates, residents, developers. And it is focused around three main core strategies: addressing the root causes of homelessness through system and policy change, expanding our system, our homelessness prevention and our housing system to serve more people, and improving the quality of life for folks who are unsheltered, and creating healthy neighborhoods for all. So I hope that the data that we're about to show you about our progress towards these goals reflects your work and the collective work of our community. Next slide, please. So we have a few big primary goals of our community plan, and one of them is to house 20,000 people by 2025. At the end of 2022, we were 48% towards that goal, having collectively assisted 9,645 people move from homelessness to housing. We also know that we have to have an impact on homelessness in our community. We have to help people maintain their housing and prevent homelessness. And so we have a goal to reduce the number of new individuals and households becoming homeless by 30%. We're currently 27% towards that goal when compared to the baseline when we started in 2020. We also know that, while we are working on these two main goals, we're working on things like strategy 3 of increasing our shelter capacity. So over the last 3 years, in addition to housing over 9,600 people, over 15,000 people stayed in our temporary shelters, temporary housing and shelters, and almost 24,000 people received homelessness prevention assistance. And I'm going to go into a little more detail on all of these in the coming slides. Next slide, please. So when we talk about housing 9,645 people, I often get the question, so what does that mean? Who does that represent? And what are those trends that we're seeing year over year? And so since 2020, we've housed over 3,000 people each year. And in 2022, over 3,500 people. And I think that reflects things like the great work happening with the Heading Home campaign, which you'll see in sort of the subpopulations that are reflected in that 9,600 number. 23% of those are families with children. We still focus on housing veterans, and 14% of the folks housed over the last 3 years were veterans. 11% transition age youth and 8% seniors. But we are working across all populations, and that number reflects multiple types of people and experiences across our community. We also know it's really important to understand where people are. And so we look at where people were housed before they became homeless, where they work, where they go to school, if they're, and where they spend most of their time. And we see in this, the folks that have been housed since 2020, 84% have an affiliation with the city of San Jose. Next slide, please. So this is one of my favorite news slides that we are sharing with folks. And I think, we often get the question, how are people getting housed? This number 9,600, it's huge, it's amazing, it's something to celebrate. But we want to provide a little bit more what that reflects in terms of how people received assistance and got housed. And so we track in our system, anytime somebody is in a program, whether it's outreach, shelter, or a housing program, we track where they exit or when they get housed. And so the sort of red parts of this pie chart here are folks who are enrolled in the supportive housing program, rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing, and had a move-in date. So they moved in while they were receiving assistance. And the outcomes there, we still maintain a 96% retention rate for our permanent supportive housing, which is amazing. The blue parts of the pie are also people who are receiving assistance from our system in some way or another. They may be staying in shelter, and folks reconnect with family or friends and move back to after that reconnection. There's also other subsidy programs that people are exiting with that assistance, and collectively, you see the collective result is 9,600 people. We know that that's not enough, and we are working together to increase the capacity. We know these programs are successful, and so we are trying to expand. The bottom chart shows, or the bottom bar shows, we have increased our supportive housing capacity 15% since the start of the community plan, and we have another 1,334 units in the pipeline. Next slide, please. And we know this work didn't start in 2020. We were building on the success of the previous community plan, the successes that all of you have been working towards well before 2020. And since 2015, the start of the previous community plan, our community has housed approximately 21,814 individuals. I think just take a minute and reflect on that. That is an incredible achievement. And it's hard to sort of believe the numbers sometimes, but it's amazing. And I'm just fortunate to be a part of this community that is working so hard towards these goals. Next slide, please. So to make progress on housing more people, we know we have to grow our system. And since 2015, what this chart shows is that growth in the number of people that our system can support in our supportive housing programs. So we see that we've more than doubled the capacity since January of 2015. And we have future growth already underway with those over 1,300 units in the pipeline. And so this reflects both rapid rehousing programs and permanent supportive housing programs. It reflects the tremendous progress made under Measure A in developing new units, but it also reflects the fact that we've had successful programs where people are getting housed and staying housed. We've been able to um, increase our grant awards as a community, have more rental assistance available, more supportive services available, and that so that both the development and the amount of funding to support people has increased over time, allowing us to increase our capacity, which we continue to try to grow. Next slide, please. So while we grow our housing capacity, we also know there are a tremendous number of people still staying outside and suffering on our streets. And so we also have a capacity to double our temporary housing and shelter. Since 2020, we have increased by 15% to over 2,100 units of temporary housing and shelter capacity, with another 384 units in the pipeline. And as I mentioned earlier, that reflects over 15,000 people have received some assistance in temporary housing over the last 3 years. The breakdown on the bottom of this slide shows the different types of shelter. We know there are multiple types of shelter in our community, all of them being valuable, and we're trying to increase the capacity across all the different types. Next slide, please. And we know that many people across our system may be accessing services as shelter as a starting point. And as I mentioned, there's multiple different types of shelter. We have safe parking programs, transitional housing programs, emergency shelter, and interim housing. Most of the people that are exiting shelter into permanent housing are being connected to a supportive housing resource, whether it's rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing. A majority of them are exiting with some assistance. So we know we have to grow the supportive housing system in order to increase the outcomes from our shelters too. We added this slide this year because we get questions often. What are the outcomes? How are people, where are people going after they leave shelter? And you see these interim housing where these are units that are connected. People have a voucher, they're connected to a supportive housing program, they're waiting for their unit to be built or looking for a unit in the market. And that 63% successful exit rate is directly connected to that assistance they're receiving. 86% of the folks that are exiting are housed via with a subsidized housing program. Next slide, please. So while we know housing as many people as possible, supporting them on their pathway to housing is a primary focus, the other major focus is trying to support people in staying housed and preventing them from becoming homeless in the first place. Our homelessness prevention system has grown tremendously since the start of this plan. We have a goal to reach 2,500, the ability to reach 2,500 households annually. We're 40%, we have a 40% increase since the start of this plan. And that homelessness prevention system has served almost 24,000 people over the last 3 years. We know that the programs are successful. 97% of the families have remained stably housed while they're receiving assistance. And 1 year later, we're only seeing 3% of those households come back into our homelessness system. Next slide, please. So one of the ways we measure, in addition to how many people we're supporting in our prevention system, we also measure the number of people that are showing up for the first time. So people who are requesting assistance at a shelter, our outreach teams are meeting them for the first time. We consider them newly homeless. And so we are working to and tracking to reduce that number. Our goal is to a 30% reduction from the 2019 baseline. We're on track to hit that goal, and we have reduced it 27% since the start of this plan. And again, sort of we are always trying to understand who's seeking help, who are the newly people who are entering our homeless system for the first time. 25% are families with children. We're seeing 15% transition age youth, 6% seniors, 3% veterans. So we have to continue to expand our programs for all of those populations. Next slide, please. This is probably my favorite slide, and I think it shows the tremendous progress we've made, and also the work ahead of us collectively as a community. When we started this plan in 2020, for every one household that was being assisted and getting housed, another 2.5 were becoming homeless. We're now at the end of 2022 at a point where for every one household housed, another 1.7 households became homeless. So I know it's funny to talk about households and points, decimal points, but we are trying to reduce that gap. We've seen the gap reduce. We want to get to a point where we're housing more people than are entering homelessness every year as a community, and we've made huge progress and still have a ways to go to see that sort of blue bar higher than the red bar is the goal. Next slide, please. That was the last slide. So I think we're making progress, and I want to again thank our nonprofit partners, folks with lived experience who've been engaging in this work, helping improve our system, our city partners. We've hopefully you see this progress reflects your work, our collective work, the collective work that we have yet ahead of us. But it's important to stop and take a moment and collectively say, we are doing great work together. We have to continue to expand and do more. And I want to thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to answer questions as well. Oh, and I was also just want to say a couple of things that we're working on next steps. We know that folks are interested in city by city data, so we're working with the cities and some of our partners to be able to provide that, so that hopefully it's useful to folks making policy at the city level. We also are our team is regularly analyzing racial equity across our system, and we're working on public reports and ways to share that in a way that's useful to all of our partners as well. So those are a couple of things that will be coming in the coming months. And thank you all for your time, and thanks, Jen, for the introduction.
Thanks so much, KJ. So lots of good information. So the way we want to try to talk about this is first, let's hear from some of our colleagues. And before we jump into the 4 that we have with us, I just want to acknowledge that looking through the audience, so many of you do this work with us. All the reason that these results are what they are is because we try as much as possible all to be moving in one direction together. And while you may be focusing on a discrete part of some of these outcomes, it all adds up. And so truly thank you for all of your work. And we wanted to highlight that a little bit by the folks that we have joining us today. I'm really happy to introduce Darcy Green, the executive at Latinas Contra Cancer, Andrea Urton, executive at Home First, Dante Lartigue, Destination Home Board member and CEO of Raising the Bar, and Jennifer Hart-Dietz, who's the CEO of PATH. And so I'm going to ask these folks a couple of questions, and then please put your questions into the chat. And then once we go to Q&A, we'll pass them off to whoever the right person is, whether it's KJ or one of our panelists. So Darcy, can I start with you? Good morning. Did anything in particular stand out from the data that KJ just showed us?
Yes, so much of it stood out. I mean, what impressive data, what hopeful data. The thing that stood out to me the most was the fact that the gap is closing. right? And we know there are no silver bullets to this work, but this work itself is making a difference. And yes, there are people continuing to become unhoused for every person that we house, but we know that that number is shrinking. And so for those of us who are in this work every day, and sometimes it can feel very overwhelming because there is so much need and it seems like there is so much resource needed to close the gap, but it's very, very impressive, exciting, provides me with a lot of hope to see that this model of the collective impact aspect of it, the grassroots aspect of it, and I believe the fact that it is so rooted in what community need is actually having the impact that it's supposed to have.
Thanks, Darcy. Andrea, what about you?
Hey, Jen, thanks. Very similar to what Darcy's point was. We work so hard to support people who are currently homeless. Home First has had an effort on really focusing on prevention the last couple of years. And so to hear that over 23,000 families received homeless prevention services was just, yes, that gives me the spirit to keep going. That gives me the strength to keep going. Everybody is doing such great work around this. And yet, systemically, there are still things we need to do if we want to close that gap. So, if we want to end homelessness, we need to stop the inflow into homeless, period. And we also have to build housing and all the other solutions all at the same time. We can't pick and choose what we're doing. And so for us, when we think about ending homelessness and preventing it, we think about three systemic issues. We think about possibly a universal basic income to people who are living at the 30% AMI, which is extremely low income. We also think about, keeping kids in school so they can bust that generational poverty, right? And so that means providing free or reduced childcare to families in need. So kids in middle school and high school and college are not being taken out of those opportunities to care for younger siblings. And then finally there's the last pillar to that, which is really, if you want to break generational poverty, home ownership is the number one tool. And so we need more first-time home ownership programs and programs for our BIPOC community especially, so that we can bust generational poverty and give these families a chance so their future children and their children are not going to be in the same situation. So that's just one of our insights that we've had at Home First.
Thank you, Andrea. Dante, what about you? What stood out for you? I know, it's hard to find. We can't hear you. Okay, I'm going to ask Jen, and then we'll come back to you, okay? Hi, Jen.
Hi, thanks, Jen, for having me today. And I wanted to kind of piggyback on Darcy's start with hope, because as I see the presentation and the data, I think it's a great way to think about our work, that this is really hopeful. The biggest thing that stood out to me, of course, as an affordable housing developer, is the success of supportive housing, right? A 96% retention rate. That shows that it works, that we're providing the right level of service and support for individuals to really thrive in their new homes. And I think we need to share that more. I think there's, a thought that maybe there's more recidivism than there is. And really, no, we're getting folks into the right level. And then they're staying there, and then they're going on, they're part of our community, and they're no longer unhoused. So I think that's a really important number. And I'm excited about, the other developments that are in the pipeline.
Thanks, Jen. Dante, can you
hear me now?
That's perfect. So actually, I'm going to ask you that question, but I'm going to ask you two questions. So we'll slip into the next one. If anything stood out in the data, and then also, what do you think is working well, and frankly, what still needs to be improved?
Well, when you're talking about 24,000 families coming into the prevention pipeline trying to maintain their housing, I think it's at 97% retention, right? Most people were able to keep their housing. That 3%, right? I think all of the data to me is like a roadmap, right? So all of these things can help us like identify where we need to, kind of work harder and or more efficiently, and really pull some resources for. So that's one thing. I think it's super important to kind of see it, because there is like this myth that we're not keeping people housed, but we really are. So it's really, I really love seeing it, right? And I know the work that we have collectively contributed to as a whole system. So, it's been fruitful.
It's hard. There's so much, I would say, disinformation about what's happening when it comes to homelessness, right? And I think part of it is really driven just by confusion. Part of it is driven by fear, and part of it is just the scale is so big that I think it's hard for people to see what's being done. And if you look outside and you still see people on the streets, you can feel like, well, is anything being done? And I think that's what's so important about showing, first of all, things are being done, and also the scale of which it requires. A single housing project isn't solving this problem anymore, right? We need dozens of them. We need to be push and go on all the strategies all at the same time. Jen, what do you think needs to be improved, or in particular, you talked about the supportive housing outcomes as one thing that's working well.
Yeah, I mean, the outcomes are working well, but I think there's definitely improvement when we look at policy and system change. I think one of the things that we really need to do is look at enhanced customer service and expedited reviews for 100% affordable housing projects with real timelines. So that means having a review within 30 days or 60 days, not what it can take, which is sometimes over a year, which increase costs and obviously increase the timeline. So I think we need to have real metrics attached to 100% affordable housing developments that help us get these units online faster.
And Jen, can I ask you, what's keeping us from doing that now?
Well, there's a lot of red tape around building affordable housing, and we go back to these myths. I don't know that the average community member really understands that there's a lot of roadblocks, right? Oftentimes we're applying for 8 to 12 funding sources for one development. We often have to add, layers of things that are beyond the units, right? In order to get the project approved. That could mean street repair, that could mean additional parking, things that, increase costs and timeline, but also there's no centralized, there could be a centralized team, I guess I should say, that, really is familiar with what the regulations and requirements are. And we're seeing this in San Diego and in LA. PATH is a statewide provider where when you centralize a team that knows about these projects, knows what we have to do in order to meet our funding regulations, that we can get them through these reviews faster. And I hope that we see that in San Jose as well.
Thanks, Jen. Andrea, what do you think is working particularly well, and where do you think we still need to be improving?
Well, there's a lot for us to improve as a system, of course. We're people, we're fallible. Our system was created by us, and yet we're still doing amazing things. So when I look at rapid rehousing, which is a program that we're fully invested in, a 96% retention rate, that's pretty awesome. So that tells me that there's a population of people who can make their homelessness brief and resolve it and keep it resolved with the right supports. They don't need lifetime support for the most part. They need additional one-time support. And so I think that's pretty phenomenal and speaks to what we all know in the system. So if we could communicate that more to the community and let people know that there are things that are working, I think that would be phenomenal. Number two, our shelter services are really not what they could be. And so currently we operate 3 of the county's large shelters, and we don't necessarily have support services there to move people from being unhoused to being housed. And when we look at the data, 44% of the people at our emergency interim housing sites go to permanent housing, and only 13%, I think it's actually lower than that, but the last number I got was 13% of the people in our congregate shelters go to permanent housing. And so what's the number one difference there? Supportive services. Somebody to help you walk through the system, somebody to help you understand the information, to get organized, to be able to provide the information needed, to be able to provide deposits, all of the things that are difficult for somebody who's living in a very chaotic environment like a shelter. So for me, that's one of the major areas that we can improve.
And Darcy, last round robin, and then we'll turn to the audience questions. What do you think is working well, and where do we need to improve?
I think the collective impact structure and the grassroots nature of this network is something that is very special to the outcomes. I mean, that that environment allows for an organization like ours to get involved in the fight to end homelessness. At LCC, we believe that housing is also healthcare. And the clients who we serve are pushed into homelessness because of a diagnosis, right? This is happening every day across our region, where folks who were able, barely, but were able to maintain their housing, to care for themselves and their families, suddenly couldn't because they were diagnosed with cancer or another type of disease of a similar impact. And so housing instability comes to the clients we serve at a time when they are very sick, when they're in active treatment. And this is incredibly preventable, not to mention also unethical. And so much of this happened much more rapidly and much more often because of the pandemic, which is what landed our organization on the doorstep of Destination Home. And so the collective impact and grassroots nature and the trust-based relationship that we as partners have with our clients is what's helping to move people into the supportive type of care that Andrea mentioned earlier. The folks that we're serving, because they are very sick, because they are in active treatment, because they are navigating a very complex and complicated and expensive healthcare system, it makes it very difficult to also swim upstream in a housing system as well. So we're able to bring those other type of wraparound services from a health care related space to folks to help prevent them being unhoused. And so through this network, we are preventing homelessness for low-income cancer patients and other really sick people, with a vision for being a county where nobody becomes unhoused because of a diagnosis. And that wouldn't happen, I don't think, without the vision behind the collective impact and allowing for many organizations who may not otherwise be involved in the housing fight to become involved in the housing fight. And really quickly about what we can do, what we can improve on, or what we might want to think about for the future. Now, having been doing this work for a short time, but daily, we may want to consider rethinking the pathways and the timeline for self-sufficiency. We know the pandemic has just the economic despair that our families continue to be in is going to be generational. And so approaching this work from a policy lens with compassion, approaching this work from a policy lens with an understanding that people were already having a very difficult time making ends meet. And then this major public health crisis, economic crisis landed in our valley, already disproportionately impacted people. And there hasn't been an abundance of income infused into people's households for long enough periods of time. So I think we need to operate with some compassion and grace with folks who are in this network, particularly on the self-sufficiency aspect of it. And I would say something we as a community can do better in our support of the partners in this network and the people who are receiving services in this network is, as urgently as we want to no longer see homelessness, we need to apply that same urgency to working toward improving the economic and social material conditions of the people who are in this network. And that includes guaranteed and universal basic income and other programs that rapidly and in a major way infuse money into households.
Thanks, Darcy. I know it has been our honor how we all came together during the pandemic, you and the other health-based agencies, some of whom I see here, hi Brett, others, who helped us broaden our aperture around the different ways that we need to be responding. And Darcy called me early in the pandemic, first couple of weeks, and she says, I have all these folks in cars that are trying to get chemo and trying not to get COVID from the house that they're in with so many other people. What are we supposed to do here? And that was really helpful for us in terms of looking at how that COVID relief effort really rolled out. So thank you too. We want to answer questions. Part of this for us was making sure that we're able to answer as many questions as possible, whether it's from the data from KJ or from one of the panelists here. And so I know that questions have been going in the chat. I'm going to ask my colleague Chelsea, if you don't mind reading us some of the questions, as many as we have time for, and then I can ask one of our folks to answer. And if I ask you to respond and you don't feel like that's the right one for you, just let me know that too, and we will move on to somebody else.
You bet. Thank you all for submitting some great questions here. The first one we're going to go into is a bit of a two-parter. The first question is, do we break down this data by gender? And so I think just in general, the data that we've shared today, but also we have a couple questions that touch on what we know about the causes of homelessness. So data that supports our understanding of what really is causing individuals to experience homelessness.
Right. KJ, I think that maybe we'll let you try to address those.
Yeah, thank you. Great questions. We do break down the data by and track by things like gender, age, race, ethnicity. Those are all things that we're monitoring and tracking and looking at equity across our housing programs and our housing system. The report itself today doesn't include all of that because it would be a bit massive, but those are things we track, and we'll I can look at see if there are some other reports that I can find to share that have the gender breakdown specifically. In terms of the cause of homelessness, there's a few different ways that we look at that. You know, we do a biannual census and survey. We ask that question about the primary cause of homelessness. Since 2015, the number one answer has been a loss of job. And similarly, in the homelessness prevention system, we ask, why are they seeking prevention? Why are they on the brink of homelessness? And I think it's over 50% report of loss of income or a reduction in income. So really, I mean, there are many causes and many factors, and that doesn't tell the whole story of why there's a loss of job or potentially a health medical condition, as Darcy mentioned. But we do know that's the primary factor is related to just the challenges of living in our community and the economics of being in this area and the cost of housing. So I hope that helps and answers the question.
And another question we have here is about the pipeline of permanent supportive housing units. Do we know how many are in the pipeline, and in particular, how many are equipped to serve families with children?
KJ.
Figured that one was coming to me too.
Yep.
I'm gonna have to. I'll pop a couple of reports for our Measure A in the chat after I finish speaking. But we have this is just the Measure A housing bond. So cities are also working on developments. You know, there's a lot happening in our community, but for the Measure A 2016 Measure A affordable housing bond, we had 47 housing developments have been funded. I think about 15 are in operation, and the remainder in some either in construction or pre-construction phases. That represents almost 4,400 new apartments and almost 700 renovated apartments. I don't have the breakdown of families versus family units versus single, but I will look for our most recent report that kind of breaks down by PSH and rapid rehousing and ELI units, all a part of the mix here, as well as some additional information and try to find that breakdown between family units and single units.
And I will add one more thing about families is KJ briefly talked about our Heading Home campaign, and we did receive a little over 1,000 emergency housing vouchers a little over a year ago. I'm not sure exactly when, as part of some post-COVID relief from the federal government. For what it's worth, they asked us how many vouchers we needed, and we asked for 10,000, and we only got 1,000. And so those are all being used for families that are experiencing homelessness, but we also know that we need a lot more.
We have a question here that references the mayor. I'm going to assume that's our new mayor of San Jose, Mayor Mahan. Is the mayor moving on his promise to reduce housing timelines? I believe it's referring to timelines. What can we do to support these improvements?
That's a great question. You know, I would say that the mayor's goals of reducing timelines are the same goals that we have. There's the community plan. In fact, Destination Home funds a planner at the city of San Jose aimed at reducing the time it takes to develop. And the unfortunate reality is there's nothing quick. Quick build is not quick. Everything takes longer than we wish that it would. But I think a mayor that is willing to both endorse the strategies that are underway and commit to doing more is critical. If we're not doing more, then we're certainly not doing everything we need to do.
Our next question is that this individual has heard that some unhoused individuals, when offered transitional housing, are not interested in this option. Do we have anything that we can say about this or any understandings?
Yeah, Dante, do you feel like answering that question?
Yeah, I hear about it a lot, but I think it has to do with just support, and it's not necessarily like resources, like helping get a job and stuff like that. A lot of folks feel in transitional housing. I know in our lead board we talk about this a lot of times, and it's just really feeling isolated and not feeling like we're in an interdependent setting where folks get to build community, right? A lot of folks are out on the streets for a long time with collectives of people, and then they go into something like transitional housing, and it's a lot more isolated than they would like, right? And so I think just kind of addressing some of those things would be helpful. You know, that's what we've heard. I think there are other factors that can go into that, like mental health services and really creating wellness plans that help people transition, right? Like I know for respective to like raising the bar, a lot of young people's their number one goal once they get housed is to like address like wellness issues, right? And trauma. So sometimes if that is not prevalent, I think it can create problems.
And Andrea, I don't know if you have anything you'd like to add to that. You know, Home First is such a big provider of interim and transitional housing in addition to lots of other things. But I know that you were on the front lines during the floods. What were the feelings for folks coming into some of the interim options that you had available?
A lot of what we hear is safety. So a lot of people don't feel safe in a congregate setting. I myself am a survivor of childhood abuse and trauma, and so sleeping in a congregate setting is a no-go for me. There is no possible way. I would literally lose my mind if I had to sleep with 250 strangers in a room at night. And so you've got people who have been traumatized every single day for a very long period of time. You know, homelessness is crisis, it is trauma. And so to expect those people who have already got previous trauma, experienced homelessness, more trauma there, to fit into what we feel they should fit into, I don't think is necessarily reasonable. We need different opportunities, different types of housing for different types of people. Like our emergency interim housing site works great for so many people who have had excessive trauma. So let's be creative. Let's be innovative as a system. How can we reform our shelters so that they're trauma informed and they don't create more damage to people who already need support? It's just one of the things.
Thank you, Andrea.
This next question is about narrative. How do we change the narrative on homelessness and the narrative on our response to it? It seems to me that the dominating narrative is that nothing is happening in cities like San Francisco, LA, and San Jose, and that they're failing in their responses to homelessness.
You know, I think that's the question of our moment, right? Is we can all define. I've been in, and I'm sure lots of you have been in many conversations where we can identify what the misinformation, the disinformation, the mythology, the lies, the things that people are saying. The question is, how do we have a response or a strategy to combat that? And I'm sure I'm not alone in seeing this wave of carceral approaches happening all over, especially the West Coast, but throughout the nation of for some reason, we've decided homelessness is just supremely frustrating and irritating now. So we just want it to go away. And somehow blaming the people that are struggling and the victims of this crisis, really, instead of the systems that continue to perpetuate it. Does anyone on our panel want to take a crack at what we can do about that? Darcy.
Well,
Oh, go for
To
it, Dante.
Darcy and then Dante.
Okay. I was watching the news one day. I do that from time to time, and there was a story about San Francisco, and what was running across the headline was homelessness severely impacting, like it was like convention or tourism, or it was some kind of like severe input. It was like homelessness negatively impacting this industry. And I thought to myself, like, what would be different if instead it said runaway economic inequality, damaging tourism, runaway economic equality, damaging business convention, systems, or whatever that is. And our need to find people to blame who are actually at the core of being the victims and survivors of this like super violent economic system that we've set up, is not going to lead us to actual solutions, because the problem are not people like the ones we all serve. The problem is that we have created a place that is impossible to live in, and that everybody is so much closer to being unhoused than they are to ever being titans of industry. And so I wonder what would be different is if we all got together to combat economic inequality and saw that as the number one issue that we need to overcome, and homelessness being the symptom of that, or the visible, the way that we're visibly able to see poverty. We're seeing economic inequality. And yes, I know there are lots of things that contribute to it, and this is just one aspect to it. But I think the way that we talk about the issue and the language we use can either help to build community, or it can further isolate and dehumanize people. And we need to urgently stop isolating and dehumanizing people.
And I'll go, Dante, to you in a second, but I just wanted to comment. I'm sure most of you saw what played out, especially online, over Silicon Valley Bank a few weeks ago. And I will tell you that I watched in wonder at the amount of elected officials and venture capitalists that were just telling the federal government that it needed to step in and act immediately. And wonder of wonders, the federal government stepped in 3 days. It was just remarkable. There was such a response to a problem that the federal government could address, and they did it over the weekend. And even some people thought that took too long, which was my favorite part. And so as you think about, and whether we rebrand homelessness as like early stage venture capitalism, I'm not sure what we should do, but like that was an amazing example in real time of if you have power and you have the ability to exercise your power, things get done. I don't know why we don't have that same cacophony calling for an end to people like living and dying on our streets, but I think most of us have been doing this for decades, just far more than a weekend. Dante, sorry to go on a little sidebar.
Well, yeah, I think we do a lot of victim blaming, in the community, and I'm talking about the community as a whole, and I think that's problematic. But again, like you said, 3 days, right? Why? Because macro level society says capitalism is good in America, right? We're a pretty greedy community, if you will, as a whole. Folks are just worried about themselves, and if we jumped, to support the unhoused folks out there the way that we jump to support economic systems like a bank collapsing, I think we would have very different outcomes. But again, I think one of the ways in which we change the narrative is really having proximity to it, right? Like a lot of folks are talking about problems that affect their daily livelihoods or peace, if you will, but they don't know much about what it means to be unhoused. They don't know what has transpired for someone to become unhoused, and all they can do is judge from afar. And I think that's where fear-mongering tactics come in, and we see most prevalent. There's a proposed project in the city of Santa Clara on Lawrence and Benton, and I get email after email about how it's going to ruin the quality of life of the folks there, right? The folks that are homeowners, the folks that have children. And one of the emails I got is, I don't want all these rapists and felons living in my backyard. And I'm like, well, I don't think, that's the case, right? Some people have had transgressions and they've paid their due to society. But most of these folks are families and folks that are just trying to get off the streets. And so we have to humanize folks, and we do that by, getting these folks that are against systems that are building housing, getting them to be proximate. We have to figure out a way to make it personal to them, in a way that is not necessarily about them, but about supporting someone in their community.
Do you want to follow up a little bit on that, Dante? You've been a leader in making our community more proximate to people with lived experience. Do you want to talk about why that's so important?
I think it's important. Like even right now, there's some groups when we go to board meetings and or not board meetings, but like, supervisor meetings and city council meetings that are against what we're doing. And I've actually, one of the things is say keep your friends close, enemies closer kind of thing. So I've become friends to some of these folks, and it's really about changing the narrative. And so most of them, even when I'm talking to folks, they don't realize that I was homeless, that I, was homeless to no fault of my own from emancipating from a system. I was not a drug user. I wasn't this or that. At the end of the day, I was a product of a system, and that system, honestly, ironically, has let me down in many ways as well. And so just teaching folks about, what actually can happen for folks that are unhoused, like just economically or just from leaving a system that has not been set up well to actually help them transition into adulthood, right? But also, like, how can you play a role in that, right? Showing up to council meetings saying, hey, look, we need to protect these people. I'm a tax-paying homeowner, and I want, for you to do X, Y, and Z. Instead of saying, no, we don't want these things, you have to, support in what is working. And I think a lot of times what's working, folks don't understand, right? Because they're so distanced from it, and it just makes them uncomfortable. And when it makes them uncomfortable, that's the only time they'll speak out, right?
Thanks, Dante. Chelsea, I think we have time for a couple more questions.
Yeah, we have some great ones. Can we hear about any strategies for advocacy regarding homelessness prevention?
Does anyone on the panel want to take that?
Housing first.
I think if the question means how to grow prevention, the prevention system started in 2017, and the budget was $1 million a year, and Sacred Heart and I think 6 or so partners, many of whom I see here, were part of that initial sort of cluster. And then during the pandemic, it swelled up to 100 or so agencies that were helping to provide cash aid. And now it's right around 20 agencies, and the budget is about $18 million a year. And I will say that it's not enough. The folks that do this work and work with families every single day can attest that we're turning families away. There's not enough money, even though it's far more of a funded effort than has ever happened before, or is happening probably in most places. And so luckily, our partners at the County of Santa Clara and the City of San Jose both understand the importance of prevention and are funding this effort. The federal government included prevention, I think, for the first time in their federal strategic plan. They could make money available. The state of California could make more money available for prevention. And I think that it's a great example of something that really can stop a problem or a crisis before it starts. And we have a network that can assume more resources.
Jennifer, can I add something to that?
Please.
Oh, sorry, I went on mute. I also just want to throw out there that if we could also view preventing homelessness as an urgent matter of public health, we will always have a looming pandemic or a looming environmental tragedy or a looming, so the ability of people to stay housed is an urgent public health matter. And so if we could also view this as a matter of public health, I think that would be effective with regard to advocacy, and also to say that neither public health or housing, in our opinion, should be carceral.
Hi.
Dante, I saw you put your hand up.
Yeah, I was gonna say, if we're talking about prevention too, like I'll speak respectfully to, like, Department of Family and Children Services and young people being from their homes. I think when we look at some of the main causes for young people being removed, like general neglect, right? So parents working, don't have time to be in the household, working 2 and 3 jobs. So if we're, again, Darcy talked about economic mobility and access, right? People need privilege and access to economic mobility resources that are going to help them facilitate a earning where they don't have to work 2 and 3 jobs, and that they can, provide for their family. Folks are a couple $100s short a lot of the times, and that leads to predatory lending and them getting loans that they can't pay back, and then they go get 2 and 3 jobs to try to make it up, and they're not able to be present in their children's lives. So again, economic mobility is going to be super important, not just for families, but for all folks in this valley. Like, it just costs way too much to live here, right? So economic mobility needs to be one of those prevention focuses across even those 24,000 families that we helped stay housed. Like, how do we get them what they need to maintain that housing long term? Money is a great thing to help them out, in that moment, but do they have the skills to maintain and the actual financial stability to maintain that housing long term?
And I think it always comes back to the same thing, which is these limited interventions, whether it's interim housing, whether it's one-time cash aid, whether it's prevention resources. Those are helping on a smaller scale, but people need either a place they can afford or wages that are commensurate with the rent that they need to be able to pay. It's really like that uncomplicated, but we seem to make it a lot more complicated for reasons that I'll never understand. Chelsea, I think we have time for one more question when we want to make sure we stop.
Jennifer, sorry to interrupt. This is Rebecca Mendides with Gilroy. I'm in the city of Gilroy, and that last question was mine, and so I just wanted to, if I could, share why I asked that question, and what I meant by it was more so around organized advocacy from our agencies, like the ones represented here today. And I know some of them have taken the bold step to train their participants to organize and mobilize people in the community. But I'm wondering, when we have things like this on our agendas, like for our city council, it took a lot to even pass the, endorsement of the community plan to end homelessness. And I say that, kind of shamefully, right? It was a heavy lift given the other folks on our council. And so I'm wondering, how can we, when we have things like this on the
we call on you all to, we have our local advocates, but how can we call on you all to come and help us advocate?
That's a great question. So this would be true for anybody here. If you need us to come to a board meeting, a council meeting, an elected meeting, a agency meeting, and talk about the community plan, the strategies, how we're addressing what your particular agency is doing, just email us and let us know. Chelsea, maybe you can put some of our email addresses in the chat. Anyone can reach out to us, and we're happy to come and do that. We have two minutes, maybe one more question.
Yeah, so we have a question here about the news this week regarding audits around the issue of homelessness work. And so the question is, I'm going to distill it a little bit, but does the panel believe that we need additional auditing to account for our successes in the county? And is there more that we all need to do to make our success known? Or perhaps is there something else at play here?
Well, I believe that came out during a campaign season. So in particular, that particular request, you would have to ask the originator what the motivation was. But I would say in general, I know that everyone that we work with is committed to being transparent and accountable. These results are published because of our commitment to being transparent and accountable. And we try to do our very best at showing the impact across multiple jurisdictions. And so it's a challenge. I see a couple of hands. Andrea, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, just a little bit. So to piggyback off of what you just said, Jen, we are audited on a regular basis by our funders. And we hold ourselves accountable also in a continuous quality improvement process where we go over every single outcome for every single program every quarter with every single manager, director, and VP. Just to make sure that we know where we're not performing, where we need to do better, or where we're doing really well. And maybe then we can generalize those results to the other programs. So if You want to audit us even more, number one. It's a burden on the nonprofits who are already understaffed. It keeps us from doing the work. At the same time, like Jen said, we're very transparent. We're more than happy to open our doors and say, these are our results. This is what we're doing. I think people would be very pleased. You can take a look at our annual reports where a lot of that information is already there. So, and I urge the community to do that. Hold us accountable because we're doing the best we can, but we know we can always be better.
Yeah, unlike the private sector or the for-profit sector, everything that the money that gets spent has to be transparent and displayed. And so being audited, whether it's HUD or the state or partners or funders, I mean, that's pretty routine. So it's exactly time to stop this session. And I know there are more questions and we don't want this to be the end. So please, if you have follow-up, if you would like us to come talk to your group or council or anything that could be helpful in making the case on a specific component of this work, just let us know, we will do it. Thank you so much for spending this hour with us. And I want to really thank KJ and our panelists for taking time this morning to help decipher some of the results that we've been sharing. And we can use everybody's help in a few ways. One, when people say nothing's going on, point them to some of these materials that show that things are going on. And number two, it's free to say that you support a housing project or an interim housing project or a new program to serve people and to write your elected official or to speak at a city council or a board of supervisor meeting. That kind of advocacy is always important, especially from folks that are in our community that are supporting this work. That would be really, truly one of the greatest things that you could do. It's very hard to go into a room like Dante was describing where hundreds and hundreds of people are screaming at you. It is very nice to have some people who say, it's okay if we put some housing here. And so we would love all of your help to do that. From all of us at Destination Home, I want to thank my team for making sure that we do this well today and all the coordination that's involved. And thank you very much for your time today. Have a great weekend. Thanks, everybody.